Okay, so let's wait a minute for the attendees to enter, and then we'll get started. So I'll just repeat the ground rules. We agreed to 20-minute presentation, 7-minute discussion, 3-minute question from the audience. If you're an attendee, you'd like to ask a question, you can use the Q&A feature and I will regulate that. Because we have a very tight deadline, let's get going. So the session's called Job Quality and Job Loss. We've got 4 great papers. Pavel's going to take it away with the first paper titled Advanced Layoff Notices and Aggregate Job Loss. You have 20 minutes. Take it away.
All right, thanks. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending this virtual session, and many thanks to Henry Hyatt for organizing the session. Thanks to Ben Griffy for discussing our paper and sending us some slides ahead of time. So my name is Pawel Krolikowski. I'm a research economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. Today I'll present the paper titled Advanced Layoff Notices and Aggregate Job Loss. This work is joined with Kurt Lunsford, who is also at the Cleveland Fed. My employer asked me to say that the views expressed here are mine. You know, maybe they're Kurt's, you never know, but they do not necessarily reflect the views of the Cleveland Fed or the Federal Reserve System. Okay, so at the heart of this project is the collection of daily establishment level data from notices filed under the Work Adjustment, Retraining and Notification Act. So for those of you who may not know, the Act requires, among other things, larger employers to provide 60 days notice before potential mass layoff to affected employees and state governments. So in this paper, we document that these WARN data can be a useful indicator of aggregate job loss. So we present 2 sets of results here today. First, we find that an aggregated national level WARN factor, which I'll be specific about later in the talk, is highly correlated with layoff data from the defunct mass layoff statistics program that used to be run by the BLS and the job openings and labor turnover survey. And secondly, we show that WARN layoffs implied by our factor perform well both in an in-sample VAR and a pseudo real-time forecasting exercise of the national unemployment rate. Okay, so the WARN Act seeks to provide workers with sufficient time to begin new job searches or obtain necessary training for a new job. That was kind of the point of the 60-day notice when the law was conceived. Each notice must include things like the name and address of the affected employment site, the date of the notice, the expected date of the first separation, and crucially for our purposes here, also the anticipated number of affected workers. Just so you know, there are 3 exceptions to the 60 days rule, but these are purposely construed narrowly by the Department of Labor. One of the exceptions is unforeseeable business circumstances, and that was particularly relevant during the COVID-19 pandemic. Nonetheless, even when citing an exception, the law requires that employers must provide a notice as soon as is practicable or as soon as possible. Okay, so we assemble these WARN data from across the United States by digitizing historical records and scraping state websites, among other things. Let me emphasize that this was a pretty large data collection effort. As of November 2020, we have about 75,000 notices affecting over 8 million workers. About 20% of our notices were filed in the year 2020. We are updating this establishment level database twice a month at the beginning, halfway through the month and at the end of the month. We have updated the database in real time since March 2019. So for the purposes of this paper, we first aggregate these establishment level notice data to a state level monthly panel that includes the number of workers affected by WARN layoffs in a particular state in a particular month. So this is an unbalanced panel because states have varying records of WARN notices. So for example, Michigan has WARN records back to January 1990, shortly after the WARN Act was passed. California, the largest state in our sample, has records back only to January 2006. But let me say that many of the largest states in our samples have records back to the mid-90s. So at the end of the day, our sample includes 33 states, and we have 23 of the 25 largest states in the sample. Okay, so how much advance notice do employers actually give in practice? So this is a histogram of the number of WARN notices on the y-axis and the the days between the anticipated layoff date and notice date on the x-axis. That's what we call advanced notice duration. So let's first look at the data from before 2020. That's indicated by the gray color here. There are four interesting features that stand out to me. First, there's a large spike at 60 days. That's entirely consistent with the requirement of the WARN Act. Second, almost 2/3 of notices are filed between 40 and 80 days prior to the anticipated layoff date. Third, there is a spike at 0, which seems to represent employers that file the WARN notice the same day that they start laying off workers. And fourth, there's a mass at 90 days, which reflects the state of New York. The state deviates from the federal mandate of 60 days notice and actually asks employers in its state to issue 90 days notice. And they've been doing that since February 2009. Now let's look at the data after 2020, denoted in black in this figure. So this data indicates that employers issued far less advance notice during 2020. Now, as you can see, the vast majority of notices actually had about 0 days notice, and only a very small fraction provided the 60-day notice or more. The sharp decline in the advance notice duration in 2020 is not all that surprising, given the unexpected nature of the pandemic recession. Okay, so before moving on, I just want to give you a sense of the raw data. So this figure shows the aggregate number of WARN layoffs and the aggregate number of layoffs and discharges from JOLTS. For the WARN series, what we do in the top panel is we started in January 2006 and basically track a balanced panel of states. And the JOLTS data are for the entire nation. So the top panel goes through 2019, and there's really two things I just want you to notice. The first is that WARN layoffs move together with layoffs and discharges and JOLTS. And the second is that WARN layoffs tend to lead JOLTS layoffs. So, for example, WARN layoffs rose sharply in October 2008, 2 months before the sharp rise in JOLTS during the 08-09 recession. And also WARN layoffs began to decline before JOLTS layoffs at the end of that recession. The bottom panel shows data since January 2020. And the main takeaway is that during the pandemic recession, WARN layoffs also tracked JOLTS layoffs relatively well. Okay, so if we had a balanced panel of states, we could just sum up WARN layoffs across all states in our sample to obtain a national measure of WARN layoffs. Okay, but we're sort of hindered by two problems, so we can't do that. The first is we have a different WARN data availability for each state, as we discussed before. So this is an unbalanced panel. So in some months we have WARN layoffs for some states, but not for others. And the second problem is that states update their WARN data on different schedules. So, you know, when we update the data in the middle of the month, we might have updated WARN notices for California, but not for Rhode Island. And this is sometimes called the jagged or ragged edge problem, and it may limit the real-time availability of the WARN data. So we have addressed both of these issues with a dynamic factor model that we use to estimate one national, what we call a WARN factor. Bless you, Kyle. There are a lot of details on the slide, but we basically take our dynamic factor model pretty much off the shelf from a Bonburo-Modugno paper recently published in the Journal of Applied Econometrics. Just to give you some details, you know, we standardize the state level data on the number of WARN layoffs to recover the first latent factor denoted by FT in equation 1 here. And this factor has state-specific factor loadings denoted by capital lambda in equation 1. What makes the model dynamic is that we assume that the factor follows an AR1 process according to equation 2. We use an EM algorithm for estimation and to impute the missing data in the panel. And the paper has more details about the specifics of the implementation. Okay, so this figure shows the WARN factor and standard deviations from July 1996 to October 2020. We also include the 68% and the 95% confidence interval on this figure. So I want you to sort of notice three things about the WARN factor. First, it's countercyclical, rising in recessions. Okay, that's a good sign for an indicator of job loss. Second, the peak in the 2009 recession is higher than the peak in the 2001 recession. and the peak in the 2020 recession is higher than the peak in the 2009 recession. That's consistent with the severity of the respective recessions. And finally, although the warn factor is a little noisy, it has few false positives. So if it's 1 standard deviation or more above 0, it indicates increasing slack in the labor market. I just want to mention that most recently, the factor is still elevated, but its peak is below those in 2001 and 2009. Okay, so that's all well and good. That's the warn factor. We sort of want to have something that has economically interpretable units. So we use the factor model to sort of back out the implied number of workers affected by warn layoffs. And we do that in 2 steps. We first sort of get the Z hat from the factor loadings, lambda S hat, and from the estimates of the factor F hat. And then we undo the standardization and sum across all our states in our sample to get sort of this aggregate measure of warn layoffs that we denote by warn hat. So this is the number of workers in our sample that are affected by warn notices. Okay, so here we plot that warn hat together with the JOLTS layoff data. Okay, in both panels we plot this warn hat. In the top panel we plot layoffs and discharges at larger establishments from JOLTS, that is for establishments with 50 or more workers. And the bottom panel we plot JOLTS layoffs and discharges for small establishments, those with 49 or fewer workers. So you can see that warn hat correlates highly with layoffs at larger establishments in the top panel, and less so with layoffs at smaller establishments in the bottom panel. That's not all that surprising because, as I mentioned, the WARN Act only applies to larger employers. Also want to mention that both WARN data and JOLTS data for larger employers are higher in recessions than in expansions. Both data also exhibit sort of a downward trend from the early 2000s to 2020. That trend is consistent with other work that documents the secular decline in job loss rates. And finally, I just want to mention that despite fewer states in our sample earlier on, you can see that the WARN data actually match pretty well the aggregate properties of the JOLTS layoffs. And the button slide also show that the WARN layoffs move very closely with the MLS, the mass layoff statistics as well. Okay, so next, we sort of test the usefulness of the WARN data as a measure of job loss and use it in a forecasting exercise of the national unemployment rate. So we start that off following Barnashon and Ricarda very closely. So that's a recent Brookings paper that sort of shows the usefulness of including worker flows for forecasting the unemployment rate. And the first step, we estimate the VAR from Barnashon and Ricarda. So the VAR includes the job finding and separation rates as measured by Scheimer in his 2012 RED paper, the change in the unemployment rate, and initial UI claims. The only thing we really do is we add to this VAR the changes in WARN layoffs, that is a change in WARN hat. And we use data through December 2019 for estimating the VAR. So in results not shown here, the VAR suggests that the WARN hat has statistically significant effects on the separation rate, the unemployment rate, and initial UI claims, even when controlling for the other variables in the VAR. So to better understand those results, we obtained impulse response functions to a surprise increase in WARN hat of 1 standard deviation in month t equals 0. And we use the estimated VAR coefficients and iterate forward to obtain the impulse response functions that you see on this slide here. As you can see, the surprise increase in WARN hat at time t equals 0 causes increases in the job separation rate, the unemployment rate, and initial claims in month t equals 1. So after a little noise in month 2, the separation rate remains elevated for about 2 years. And this increased separation rate implies that the unemployment rate increases gradually by about 1% in 3 years. So just as a side note, so the magnitudes, at least for me, who am not a macroeconomist, are a little difficult to interpret with these impulse response functions. So in the paper, we perform a simple back of the envelope calculation that suggests the innovations to WARN hat during the most severe part of the 08-09 recession, which was at the end of 2008, indicate that the unemployment rate would increase roughly 0.4 percentage points over the next 12 months. And just to be clear, that's over and above the increase in the unemployment rate indicated by the other variables in the VAR. Back to these impulse response functions, the last thing I wanted to say is that the surprise increase in worn hat has no discernible effect on the short run impact of no short run impact on the job finding rate in the top left figure here. And that's consistent with our intuition that worn data inform the job separations margin, but not the finding margin. Okay, so next we use the estimates from this VAR to forecast the national unemployment rate. Okay, so forecasting is made pretty easy because the VAR includes changes in the unemployment rate. So given data through period T-1, in particular the level of the unemployment rate, we can use the estimates from the VAR coefficients, iterate that forward to get forecasts of the national unemployment rate. So the total sample is again starts in July 1996 to December 2019. The sample period, because we use 11-year rolling windows for the VAR estimation, the sample period for the forecast errors is January 2008 to December 2019. And we follow Barnashar and Ricardo sort of very closely with implementation. So here are forecasting results for the national unemployment rate. The first row shows the root mean squared prediction errors of the VAR4 model at various horizons and months. So just to remind you, the VAR4 model includes just 4 variables: the job finding and separation rates, the changes in the unemployment rate, and initial UI claims. Not surprisingly, the forecast accuracy declines with the horizon in the first row. The next 2 rows in the table add the worn factor and worn hat, respectively, to the VAR4 model and show the relative RMSPEs. So the results in rows 2 and 3 indicate that including either the worn factor or worn hat does not hurt the forecasting performance of the VAR4 model at any horizon that we study. And in fact, including these variables gives statistically significant improvements at horizons H=3 and beyond. So these just sort of the timing of these results is consistent with our in-sample impulse response functions from a couple of slides ago. Now, admittedly, our reductions in RMSPE are modest. They're no more than sort of 5% at a given horizon, but they are statistically significant. So we think that there's something real that the worn data are contributing. And also keep in mind that we are evaluating our forecast over a relatively short sample that includes only 1 recession. So the scope for improvement is somewhat limited. Okay, so in this paper, we ask a simple question. Can worn data be a useful indicator for aggregate job loss? I think the short answer is yes. Worn data are consistent with several indicators of job loss, and they contain useful information both in and out of sample. So in the future, we plan to release updates of our data for the benefit of other researchers and analysts. And we think that these data has, at least 4 uses by people in the session and otherwise. First, the worn data can measure the effects of local demand shocks on various outcomes. So for example, researchers in the past have used the mass layoff statistics and limited worn data to study labor market and schooling outcomes after demand shocks. Our data could be used to extend and expand these analyses. Second, worn data could be merged with other micro data about workers and firms. So for example, I'm working with Census economists to study the causal effect of the WARN Act on worker outcomes. Third, our WARN data can be used to study the effects of state amendments to the Federal WARN Act. So as I mentioned before, New York changed the notice period from 60 days to 90 days in February 2009. And more recently, New Jersey has considered a similar change. Our database provides evidence about how these legislative changes impact WARN notice provision and their timing. And finally, we think that these WARN data can be used to monitor labor market activity in real time. So, for example, I've used the WARN data with co-authors to study the geographic and industry distributions of WARN layoffs during the pandemic recession, and Mariana Kudliak and Erin Wolcott, another discussant in this session, have used the WARN data to study the nature of layoffs during the pandemic recession. So that's all I have for today. Thanks so much for your time.
Great. Thanks, Pawel. So we'll go straight to the discussion. Ben, if you want to take over the screen share, hopefully they made you a co-host. Okay. And just unmute yourself. And you have 7 minutes, and then we'll get to the questions.
Okay. Everyone can hear me? Okay. So first, thank you so much, Henry, for including me in the session, and I'm really happy to discuss this and Etienne's paper as well. Of course, studying layoffs it's important to do, right? It's something we need to understand, and typically we're going to use JOLTS or MLS, and kind of this paper is motivated with, we're going to record both of those. Those are going to record layoffs with some lag. Now, is it possible to use these warn notices instituted by a federal statute to preemptively predict some of these layoffs and other associated labor market statistics? So this is already pretty well summarized, but the key thing is that there's a 60-day notice before layoffs take place at most employers, and these are publicly posted. And now what they're going to do is construct a panel of warn notices and then look at how useful this data is in predicting state and aggregate labor market outcomes. So they go through 4 different components. So first, they're going to look at the state level, because this data is all initially state level, and see how it affects unemployment claims in the immediate future, changes in the unemployment rate, and changes in private employment. Next, they'll aggregate that data up from the state level to the national level using a dynamic factor model. So that's going to give them an indicator at an aggregate level of the predicted level of layoffs based on these warn notices. They're going to use that in a VAR with a variety of important labor market aggregates. And finally, they'll use that for real-time forecasting. So this is going to give us information in advance of what's happening in the labor market. Can we also use that to, in real time, understand what's going on in the labor market? And what they'll find is that this data is pretty useful across all of these margins. At the state level, it's going to be able to predict unemployment claims 2 months prior to those claims. At durations of 1 and 3 months prior, it'll predict changes in the unemployment rate. And 1 and 2 months prior, it'll predict changes in private employment. And I accidentally picked the small establishments figure here, but it also does well in all these aggregate series. And it does lead these other alternative surveys by a short duration, which is what we would expect in this data set. In terms of those real-time forecasts, it also does a good job, particularly over longer horizons. So I think this is a certain success of this data's ability to supplement our understanding of layoffs and be able to predict these outcomes in advance of what we might find in a variety of other survey data sets. So I had Bradley just one question about the paper, which we were lucky to be able to discuss a little bit in advance. So there are 3 exceptions to the filing notice. So of course, the first, obtaining capital to prevent a shutdown. The idea is that if people are trying to obtain capital, they don't want to send a signal that the firm is going under. The lenders might run away. The second, unforeseeable business circumstances, which I'll get back to in a second. And the third is a natural disaster. And the second one was a bit of a concern for me initially. If firms don't have to, if firms are more likely to file much closer to the actual layoff date, and if that's varying with the business cycle, that could be an endogeneity problem, an identification problem. So we talked about this a little bit in advance, and what was suggested was that the advance notice duration plotted here doesn't look unreasonable, and I agree with that. So right here is the median advance notice duration. It's going to fluctuate around 60 days. Below that is the 25th percentile. And above that is the 75th percentile.
And I think we're like not seeing what you're seeing. I mean, I don't know if anyone else is noticing this, but I'm seeing like the actual non-presentation mode. I mean, I still understand what you're saying.
Is that, can you see it now? Is it?
Sort of now, yes. Oh, a second ago.
Like that?
Yeah, then
okay.
I think it's closer to full screen.
Okay, well, sorry about that.
I mean, we can see the slides, it just became apparent when you're pointing to stuff, so.
Oh, you can't see when I'm pointing to stuff? Is that the problem?
Yeah, the mouse was like not lining up with, I believe, what you were trying to point to. I don't know if anyone else noticed that, but just, I think this is better, so.
Okay, so my thought process was that this looks reasonable, that there's not an endogeneity problem associated with it. I'd like to see the mean in addition to the median, because of course, if there are a lot of people filing closer to their actual notification date, that could affect the mean, and that might be an endogeneity problem. And I'm a little over time, so there are a couple of things that I thought might be nice extensions to look at in the future. I've sent you my slides so we can discuss those later. And just to sum up, it's a nice paper. It does a good job introducing a really valuable data set, and I think there's lots of things to do with it. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Ben. So if you're in the audience, please use the Q&A feature to ask questions, and then Pawel can field those. Pawel, why don't you take a minute to respond to Ben if we don't have any questions coming through the attendees?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, so this is the picture, I think, that that Ben was showing us. So the advanced notice, the duration of the advanced notice, the median of the advanced notice duration hovers about 60 days. Again, not surprising given the law, and it doesn't move much over the business cycle. Actually, there's just basically this one drop here, and that's September 2001, associated with the terrorist attacks. And then also since 2020. This median duration has fallen. So obviously at the beginning of the pandemic, recession fell to zero. A lot of firms were taken by surprise, and has only recently gone up. So we're not overly concerned about sort of this, during a recession, these advanced notice duration falls. And again, because these reasons are pretty narrowly construed by the Department of Labor. I think that's all I had to say. I'm happy to talk with Ben about the other point that was on the slide that we didn't have time to discuss.
Okay, great. Well, that's actually perfect timing. So it's exactly 30 minutes. Great. So thanks so much. Our next paper is by Etienne. If you want to take the floor. It's titled The Ins and Outs of Involuntary Part-Time Employment. You've got 20 minutes. Take it away.
Okay, thanks a lot. So I presume you can see my slides, right? Yeah. Okay. Okay, thanks, and thanks, Henry, for putting this session together. Thanks, everyone, for attending. So this is joint work with Danielle Borowczyk-Martins from Copenhagen Business School. And it's pretty much follow-up work from this paper where we've been looking at fluctuations in hours per worker. And in that paper, basically, we show that when you look at fluctuations at the intensive margin, it's pretty much driven by changes in the share of part-time work. And as a result, you can actually use worker flows in and out of part-time work to understand better the dynamics of the intensive margin. Okay, so that's on the one hand. On the other hand, there is a large literature that has used worker flows to look at fluctuations at the extensive margin, so changes in the unemployment rate. Okay, so what we want to do in this paper is basically to bring these two pictures together. Okay, so concretely, we're going to study labor market dynamics using a five-state model. We're going to classify workers into full-time employment, voluntary part-time employment, involuntary part-time employment, unemployment, and non-participation. Okay, and so within this framework, we're going to think of involuntary part-time work and unemployment as two states where there is a constraint on labor supply. Okay, so we want to compare the dynamics of these two labor market states. Okay, so we're going to address two questions. First one, what are the sources of fluctuations of involuntary part-time work? And in particular, are they different from the sources of fluctuations of the unemployment rate? And second question is, what are the interaction between involuntary part-time work and the unemployment rate? Okay, so you will see that this project is it's pretty much about solving some problems with the data. Okay, we're going to use CPS data, and the first problem that we're going to address is this redesign of the CPS in 1994. So I guess many of you are aware of this methodological change in the CPS. So I'll tell you what we do about it. And also we're going to address classification errors, so workers who switch back and forth between voluntary and involuntary part-time work. Okay, so we're gonna address these different issues. So like I said, we're gonna have a methodological contribution in the sense that we're going to provide a method to deal with the redesign of the CPS in 1994. So I will tell you a little bit how it compares to a method which is often used, which is based on the adjustment factors that were computed by Polivka and Miller. So I'll tell you a little bit about the relationship between what we do and what is usually done to adjust the CPS. And so once we have this consistent time series, we're going to establish mainly 4 findings about involuntary part-time work. The first one is that it's a very transitory labor market state. The second one is that it's transitory because it interacts a lot with other employment states. So it interacts a lot with full-time employment and voluntary part-time work. Okay, and on the other hand, you will see that there is very little interaction between involuntary part-time work and the unemployment rate. Okay, third, we're gonna show that there is a systematic pattern in recession where you see an initial jump in transitions from full-time to involuntary part-time work, and then a slow recovery, which is driven by the fact that involuntary part-time workers, they go back to full-time employment, but it takes time. And fourth, we're gonna see that the most recent recession, so the 2001 and the 2009 recession, they look a bit different from earlier recessions, so different from recessions in the 1980s and 1990s. Okay, so let me go quickly over the definitions and data. So the data, we mostly use the monthly files of the CPS. And in just a second, I will tell you how and why we also use data from the so-called March CPS, so the annual social and economic supplements of the CPS. And we're going to use standard definitions. So part-time employment means less than 35 usual hours per week. And in voluntary part-time work, this is based on this question from the CPS questionnaire. So some people work part-time because they cannot find full-time work or because business is poor. Others work part-time because of family obligations or other personal reasons. So this is what we're going to use to identify involuntary part-time workers. So if you've worked with the CPS, you know that things have changed in January 1994. And so actually before 1994, we have limited information about usual hours in the sense that it is only when you've been working less than 35 hours during the reference week that the CPS is going to ask, do you usually work less than 35 hours? And second, and I guess more importantly, the definition of involuntary part-time work, how to say it, it's been tightened during the redesign of the CPS. So currently, if you want to be counted as an involuntary part-time worker, you must want and be available for full-time work. So if you want this more recent definition, it brings involuntary part-time employment closer to the notion of being unemployed. And so we like this definition more. But obviously here we're going to see a shift in the counts of involuntary part-time workers in 1994. Okay, so these are data issues that we need to address. And we want to address these data issues to feed this Markov chain. Okay, so this Markov chain is really the lens through which we want to look at labor market dynamics. So we want to classify workers into full-time employment, voluntary part-time employment, involuntary part-time employment, unemployment, and non-participation. And then using this Markov chain, we want to look at what we call the involuntary part-time employment rate, which is the ratio between involuntary part-time workers and the size of the labor force. Okay, so we want to relate the dynamics of this involuntary part-time employment rate to the dynamics of transition probabilities. Okay, so how are we going to adjust the data? We're going to have a two-step procedure. So in the first step, we're going to adjust labor market stocks. And once we have corrected labor market stocks, we're going to correct labor market flows. Okay, so labor market stocks, this is where we're going to use data from the annual social and economic supplements of the CPS. So if you know a little bit about the March CPS, you know that it provides information about what workers have been doing in the previous calendar year. Okay, so in particular, you know how many weeks they've been working, how many weeks they've been working part-time, and if they've been working part-time, how many, whether they work part-time because of slack work or because they could not find full-time work. Okay, so if you think of the ASSA, you can use it to construct annual stocks of part-time workers, and these stocks, you know, they should be related to what we see in the monthly CPS. Okay, so that's the correlation that we're going to use in order to correct the monthly CPS. So I'll just skip the details of the procedure to show you how it works in practice. And so here I want to bring your attention to the right panel. So the right panel, it counts involuntary part-time workers. So on the y-axis, these are millions of workers. And I'm showing you different lines. So you see this kind of step function line. These are annual counts of involuntary part-time workers from the March CPS. The solid green line, these are the counts that come directly from the raw monthly CPS. So in particular, you see this large discontinuity in 1994. Okay, and finally, the dashed line, that's the line that we obtain after we implement our adjustments. So the key thing that I want to say this. There is a discrepancy always between the ASEC and the monthly data, okay? And we don't want to remove that discrepancy, okay? The only thing that we require is that the discrepancy should remain the same across the 1994 break, okay? So that's how we adjust the data, okay? So I know it looks like I just shifted this line downwards to remove any gap, okay? But we do something slightly more detailed in the background. Okay, so now that we have corrected labor market stocks, we're going to adjust worker flows. And here the idea is pretty simple. Worker flows, they predict some changes in stocks. But now that we have corrected changes in stock, we can adjust the flows so that they match our adjusted changes in stocks. Okay, so this is what is also called marginal adjustment. Usually it is used to account for rotational sample attrition. In our context, it's also going to account for these shifts in labor market stocks over time. Okay, so this is what we do in terms of data adjustment. We do a lot of robustness checks, and I just want to emphasize one, which is here we make this adjustment at a disaggregated level, such as age groups, education group, gender, marital status. So we do it for 20 different groups, and we make this data available. So if anyone is interested into looking at the dynamics of part-time work, involuntary part-time work for some subset of the population, you're very welcome to use the data that we've constructed. Okay, so let's move on to the results. Let me remind you of the two questions that we have in mind. First, what are the sources of fluctuations of involuntary part-time work? And in particular, are they different from sources of fluctuations of the unemployment rate? And second question, what are the interaction between these two labor force states? Okay, so the two labor force states that we are talking about are this blue guy here, the involuntary part-time employment rate, and the unemployment rate here. And so we're gonna do a kind of comparative analysis of their dynamics. Okay, so the first thing that we're gonna do is just take the pool of involuntary part-time workers and look at how many workers enter and how many workers leave in a given month, and do the same exercise for the pool of unemployed workers. Okay, the thing that I want to emphasize here is that involuntary part-time work, it's extremely transitory. So if you sum up all the inflows and if you sum up all the outflows, what you see is that about 2/3 of involuntary part-time workers, they were in a different state in the previous months, and about 2/3 will be in a different state in the months that follows. Okay, and so the reason why I call it highly transitory is that it is more transitory than the unemployment rate, right? And we're talking of the US unemployment rate, which we already know it has fast dynamics. So the dynamics of involuntary part-time work is even faster than that of the unemployment rate. Okay, let me complement this picture by showing you some plots of transition probabilities. And here I want you to focus on this one on the top left corner. So this plot is showing you the transition probability of moving from full-time work into involuntary part-time work. Okay, so that's the solid line. And on the same plot, we show the probability of moving from full-time employment into unemployment. Okay, so what you see over time is that of the risk of moving to unemployment for full-time workers, it has gone down. But so in relative terms, the risk that full-time workers move to involuntary part-time work has increased. And this is true in relative term, but in fact, at the end of the Great Recession, it was true in absolute term that you see this massive jump in the probability of moving from full-time to involuntary part-time work. Okay, so that's you will see this result later again when we zoom in on recession episodes. Okay, so we look at all the other transition probabilities. I mean, the bottom line is that we see a lot of cyclical variation in all these different transition probabilities. So we try to summarize that information by doing a variance decomposition. So this variance decomposition is going to tell us the contribution to the short-run variation of each transition probability. Okay, so once again, we do it for involuntary part-time work, and we do it for unemployment, and we compare the results. The key takeaways in this table are the numbers that I'm highlighting here. Take the first row here and add up the numbers. You see that 50% of the short-run variation of involuntary part-time work is driven by the interaction directly with full-time employment. Okay, and if you add up the numbers on the second row, it tells you that there is another 25% of the cyclical variation that is coming from the interaction between involuntary part-time work and voluntary part-time work. Okay, so together, 75% of the variation is really coming from, within employment fluctuations. Okay, on the other hand, the interaction between unemployment and involuntary part-time work, they are very limited. So if you think, for instance, of this story that, during a recession, the unemployed, they have no other option than to take on part-time work in order to return to employment. You see that it's going to explain about 10% of the cyclical variation of involuntary part-time work. And the other way around, if you look at fluctuations of the unemployment rate, the contribution of involuntary part-time work is very small. It's about 5% of fluctuations of the unemployment rate. Okay, so very little interaction here. Okay, I'm going to skip these results, and I'm going to zoom in on recessions. So what we do when we zoom in on recession is that we take our counterfactual changes of the involuntary part-time employment rate, okay, and we track the dynamics of involuntary part-time employment during a recession. Okay, so everything on the plots that I'm going to show now is relative to the start of the recession. The solid line is the involuntary part-time employment rate, so in percentage point difference from the start of the recession. And then we look at the contribution of different inflows and outflows. So here we look at the early recession in the data. And in the early recession in the data, what really seemed to be important is this, this outflow going from involuntary part-time work to full-time employment. So this is really what was driving the recessionary increase in involuntary part-time work. What we've seen in more recent recession is that there's been a higher contribution of transition from full-time to involuntary part-time work. So it's highly visible here in the Great Recession. You see that most of the contribution initially is because of this big spike in the transition probability of going from full-time to involuntary part-time work. And then later on, the slow recovery of the outflow is picking up. Okay, so we see similar differences if we look at this. We decompose changes in involuntary part-time work into changes that come from workers who report slack work conditions and workers who report that they cannot find a full-time job. So cannot find full-time job was the most important contributor in the early recession. And now it's the opposite. In more recent recession, we've seen slack work conditions play a more important role. Okay, I just summarize and I tell you why we think this is important. So just to summarize, involuntary part-time work is very transitory, and its transition is mostly driven by the interaction with other employment states. Okay, we see little interaction between involuntary part-time work and unemployment. And somehow it looks like the two most recent recessions were different from earlier recessions. Okay, so why is it important and why is it useful? We think, first of all, this is interesting for people doing research using search models because it suggests a labor adjustment channel that is a bit different from the usual job creation and job destruction channel. So it looks as if following a negative shock, there are workers who are going to be permanently separated from their employer, and so they need to search for a job elsewhere. But you have some workers who they seem to remain in the internal labor market of the firm. Okay, and so they wait here until they are being brought back into full-time work. Okay, so that seems like a labor adjustment channel that is a bit different from the job creation, job destruction channel. And second, we think that these findings, they are important when you think on how to measure labor market slack. Okay, so you know that in some measures, we adopt involuntary part-time workers to discourage workers, unemployed workers, and so on and so forth. We think it is important to bear in mind that the sources of dynamics are a little different when you look at involuntary part-time work versus looking at unemployed workers. So maybe we want to raise a note of caution. When you add up these numbers, you should bear in mind that the underlying dynamics might be a little different. Okay, I'm a little over time, so I stop here. Thanks very much.
Great. So I believe we have Erin discussing. So if you'd like to share your screen, you have 7 minutes. So did they make you co-host?
I am a co-host, so I'm a little bit worried because I thought I was discussing the other two papers.
I think
okay, sorry. I mixed it up.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, Ben.
I was worried too there. Okay. So if I go to, you're able to see the mouse here? Okay, cool. Well, thank you again for inviting me to discuss another important and interesting paper. So this paper is really about measuring involuntary part-time work, and it's both important and difficult to do. So Etienne kind of finished his presentation talking about a number of the reasons why involuntary part-time work is important. So it measures labor market slack. It has different cyclical properties than unemployment, et cetera. And the difficulty in measuring it is that the CPS was redesigned in 1984 and the definition changed. So involuntary part-time work, it requires that someone wants to work full-time, but they currently work part-time, defined as less than 35 hours, because they either face slack work conditions or they can't find a full-time job. And prior to the redesign, usual hours were only recorded if the worker worked part-time during the reference week. And thought there was a line missing. Okay. And the problem with that is that it's going to undercount part-time workers. There are going to be a number of workers who happen to work full-time during the reference week, but are normally part-time workers. And this paper is about, at least in part, adjusting the data prior to 1994 so that it's consistent with the subsequent data. Okay. Okay. So the basic idea of what they're going to do is they're going to use the March CPS, which they're able to provide a consistent definition throughout this time series, and predict, estimate how it relates to the monthly CPS after 1994. With that series, they're going to backcast what the previous, the stocks of involuntary part-time should be prior to 1994. So they'll take the March CPS where they have a consistent definition and backcast it to get a series. And the key assumptions, as Etienne mentioned, there's no discrepancy between, or the discrepancy between the monthly and the March CPS is not affected by this redesign. And once they hold the definition of part-time employment, involuntary part-time employment fixed, the March CPS is going to measure the same thing over time. What they'll find is that prior to 1994, the CPS overstated the incidence of involuntary part-time. And that's because afterwards it became a more restrictive definition. Then they'll use the adjusted stocks to estimate transition probabilities. Okay, so what do they find? I think some of the key findings are thinking about what drives the variability of involuntary part-time relative to unemployment, and understanding those differences are important. What they find is that within job movements or within employment movements, so inflows from and outflows to full-time employment, as well as inflows between voluntary and involuntary part-time employment, are going to account for the bulk of the variability of involuntary part-time over time. And once they account for potential spurious transitions between involuntary and voluntary, the flows between involuntary and full-time become even more important. Now, unemployment is going to be largely, the variability is going to be determined by flows to and from full-time work and flows to and from non-participation. So to sum up the difference in dynamics, involuntary part-time is going to be driven primarily by flows within a job, whereas unemployment is going to be driven by job finding and entry and exit. And that's an important distinction. Okay, so so these are just a couple questions about the approach that I'm not as familiar with all the conditions that all the changes that took place at the redesign. But given that the measurement changed in the monthly survey, could there be things that changed in the March survey as well that might impact the consistency of that series over time? And another thought I had when I was reading this, could there be other sources of mismeasurement that change between those two series? So are there any changes in other definitions or how questions are asked that might affect, say, full-time employment or something like that? The other thing I thought was that there's potentially additional information that could be used to target these series, particularly from transitions. And I thought that there might be two ways of thinking about that. So you could potentially estimate a conditional logit at an individual level on an individual's employment status and include something like their previous or subsequent transitions, as well as a variety of other characteristics. And if you aggregated that up, what does that look like? The other one that's more in the spirit of what you're doing here is estimating stocks and flows jointly using a state space model with a Kalman filter. And the reason that I think might be valuable is that the different part-time employment statuses do have different transition probabilities, and that could help in estimating these stocks over time. But to conclude, it's a nice paper on an important topic. Part-time employment is, I think, understudied, and certainly there should be more papers out there. It documents some important regularities about involuntary part-time employment and provides a nice data set for future research on this topic. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. So Etienne, you got 30 seconds if you want to say anything or respond. Otherwise, well, respond. Go ahead and respond, and then Amanda or Kathrin, you want to share your screen?
Okay, no, I just want to say thanks for these great comments. The issue you raise, you know, whether the ASEC has not been affected by the redesign. I agree. That's a serious question. We've searched for evidence about it. We haven't found any, but yeah, it is a concern to us. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Okay, great. So very happy to have Kathrin and Amanda presenting from Trend to Cycle, the changing careers of married women and business cycle risk. You've got 20 minutes.
Hi, so I'm glad we could all be here. This is something that, you know, makes us better at what we do and keeps us excited about what we do. I'm Amanda, and this is joint work with Kathrin, who will be available in the Q&A if you have questions. And to cover my bases, these are my views. They're not views of my employers, of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, the Federal Reserve Bank, or the executive branch. Okay, so in this paper, the question that we're after is we want to understand how the rise in women's employment has impacted US business cycle dynamics. And there's a very small but growing literature on this. Our contribution is to emphasize that when we think about the different reasons, the different theories that are out there of why married women's employment has increased over time, they're going to have different implications for how business cycles will be affected. So in particular, we're going to look at, you know, decreasing the gender wage gap, decreasing opportunity costs of work, or increasing returns to experience. And you're going to find that those three different factors are going to have very different implications for either dampening or exacerbating employment volatility over the business cycle. Okay, so why do we think this is an interesting question to begin with? Well, first is that married women are making up a larger and larger component of the US labor force. From 1950 to 2010, they have increased their own employment by 50%. And when we add that up and we look at the macro share, they're accounting for 20% of aggregate hours, which is 25% larger than what they accounted for in 1950. When we think about the business cycle, married women are also an important demographic. In Kathrin's PhD work, what she documented is that married women have about 50% lower hours volatility than the rest of the population. Their presence actually reduces total aggregate volatility by 12%. And this is, you know, controlling for differences in demographics, differences in occupational structure. It really seems to be something about being a married woman. So one thing that you could do if you wanted to connect these two facts is you could try to look at the data alone, but that's pretty difficult because, you know, luckily recessions are few and far between. So when we think about younger cohorts, they might have only experienced a couple of recessions in their lives. So we're going to use a model instead to try to predict what these changes in employment trends imply for business cycles. Okay, so we want a large structural model that's consistent with many features that we see in the data. The first thing that we have to understand is why do these married women have lower cyclical volatility to begin with? In Kathrin's PhD work, what she discovered is that the key margin is that married women actually exit the labor force less during recessions. In other words, married women's labor supply is counter-cyclical. So when you think about a married woman versus another participant in the labor market, you want to think that a married woman is somebody who's moving across participation margin very often. And then during a recession, married women quit at higher frequencies, but during recessions, they quit less. Okay, so that's what I have here. And the other thing is that we're going to focus on hours volatility. We just saw a paper about part-time margin, and that is there, but and we will have it in the model, but 78% of the reduced volatility of married women is from the extensive margin. Okay, so the first big component about what we're doing is we're going to have a theory of married women that makes them less cyclical over the business cycle in the same way that they look in the data. And now we have to connect this to the trend. What we see over time, this is all work done in the CPS, is that married women have become increasingly attached to the labor force. So in the past, when they're moving in and out of the labor force, let's say maybe they're out of the labor force for childcare needs, and then they rejoin the labor force, things like that. But in recent times, they're more likely to just stay attached. They're not making this quit margin so much. So why is that? Well, part of it is that married women have very different careers than they used to. So if we look at different cohorts born in the 1930s versus cohorts born in the 1960s, we've seen these cohorts over most of their life, and we can put them into different bins. The first bin that we want to think about is career women. These are women, when I look over their life cycle, they have annual hours that are high. They look like they're full-time, working full-time, and they work full-time almost every year that I see them. This is in the PSID. You can contrast those to part-time women. So almost every year that I see in the PSID, they're working what would amount to part-time work. Then there's a third bin, which is women who are mostly not in the labor force. I barely ever see them work in the PSID. Their average annual hours are less than 400. And the last are life cycle women. These are women that kind of follow this path where maybe they work when they're young, or very young. They might drop out when they have young kids, but then they go back to work mostly full-time, or when they reach prime age, perhaps they have lower childcare needs. So when we think about how the trend in female labor force participation has changed over time, a lot of it is that these never working women have disappeared. These life cycle women have also shrunk by more than half. They're the red component in these bars. And the biggest rise has been in these career women, women who work more than 1,500 hours a year. Now, how does that relate to the business cycle dynamics I was talking about before? So before, you have to remember that the reason that a woman's business cycle volatility is less than, let's say, her husband is because she has the choice of whether or not to quit. And she's making that choice and moving in and out of the labor market at a higher frequency. These career women tend to look more like their husbands. They're no longer exercising that choice. They may be facing different shocks, different changes to their circumstances, but they're remaining consistently employed. When you remain consistently employed, you no longer have the option to have a counter-cyclical labor supply. You just have a labor supply that's, you work whenever you can. Okay, so when we put this all together in a model, so we have a model with women in the 1940s cohort that have the different careers that I just spoke about in proportion to their population shares in that decade. And they also have business cycle volatility that's consistent with this counter-cyclical labor supply. We're going to run through experiments. So we're going to increase women's labor force participation by increasing the return to experience. And this is going to kind of have this surprising effect. This is one of our main results. So normally in macro models, when you increase return to experience, it's kind of lowering, it's having a dynamic effect on labor supply. So since you're working in order to raise your wages tomorrow, you're less sensitive to shocks that happen to you today. That's a very typical macro labor supply elasticity concept that would reduce the volatility of your labor supply. Counterintuitively, once you actually increase the share of these career women in the labor force, you do get that within group, they have lower volatility, but it's exactly these career women that have the highest volatility to begin with. They don't have the participation margin to adjust. They don't have counter-cyclical labor supply. And so we actually get that employment becomes more cyclically volatile when we have more career women. With the gender wage gap, it actually happens to go the other way. I'll talk more about this. It's going to do what we expected and dampen cyclical volatility. The fixed cost of working, you can think about these papers, or it could be opportunity cost of working, the engines of liberation. We now have market childcare, we now have appliances and so forth. this is also going to make recessions more volatile. Okay, so the whole point, if you take nothing from this, is we had a group that had low cyclical volatility. We increased their share in the labor market, but yet it's very possible that we increase cyclical volatility because of the reason that they've increased their labor supply. Okay, so I'm gonna have a very brief sketch of our model. It's a full structural model of a life cycle model of joint labor supply over the life cycle and over the business cycle. We've been careful to try to get cross-sectional dynamics correct and to get the cyclical dynamics correct. Okay, so basically it's a two-person household. We're gonna think of it as a husband and a wife. It's a life cycle model, which is important because we're gonna have child raising years in which women may want to lower their labor supply. Married men are just going to be an exogenous income process. They work when work is available and they can't work when work is not available. Married women are the ones that are going to make labor supply choices. So they can choose whether or not to search for a job, whether to quit. When they search, they can choose their search intensity, and when they're employed, they can choose their hours. So what's a recession in this model? It's going to be a period of low job finding rates for everybody, higher job loss rates for everybody, and lower wages. This is going to be partial equilibrium, so it's easy to put in a lot of very rich detail in the risks that households face. So we will have divorce risk, we have wage scarring from unemployment, which can make the effects of a recession even larger. We'll have a sort of matching in the sense that high earning women marry high earning men and so forth. Okay, this is the only math I'm going to show, and I'm not going to quite define things, so let's focus on the words that I've added. This is a simple Euler equation of labor supply. So on the left-hand side, you have the gains from working. There's a static consumption gain of what you can eat today. There's going to be a dynamic experience gain where the more that you work, the more that you build human capital, and you're going to work until that's equal to your disutility of work on the margin. Okay, so why would a woman stay at work, perhaps during a recession? So they're going to stay at work if the static gain is high, so the margin utility of consumption is high. This will be the case if the husband's income is low, if their own wage is high, or if it's particularly high relative to productivity at home, because they can also work at home to make this consumption good. They'll also not quit if their disutility or their fixed cost of work is low. And then they'll also not quit if the dynamic gain is high. So there's two margins here that are important. The first is a notion of precautionary labor supply. So even if my husband doesn't lose his job during the recession, I might expect him to. So I'm going to continue to work. I'm not going to quit to perhaps go to home production as a way of buffering these risks. There's also job hoarding. This is the idea that if I quit my job today, it might be hard to find a job tomorrow. And so I'll be worried about return to experience and the job finding rate in the future. Now you can already see how this is going to interact with the three theories of the trend in women's labor force participation that I mentioned. For example, the gender wage gap and the fixed cost of work. They're entering this model through the static costs, whereas the returns to experience are these dynamic costs, which we normally think of are kind of the most important in a fresh sense. Okay, so let's kind of break this down. Let's first look at over the business cycle. So we have married women quit less in a recession for the reasons I mentioned. There's a couple more. So one thing that would work against them is a typical RBC motive. Wages are lower during recessions, and so the fixed gain of working might be lower just because productivity falls. So it's a competition between those two effects. I should mention that we don't find any large entries into the labor force during recessions. I keep talking about quits. So that's because we have a lower added worker effect because it's hard to find a job in a recession. So you might want to enter the labor force to ensure against household income risk, but during a recession, it's just hard to find jobs, so that's not very useful. So what you end up is a picture like this. The key thing that I want you to see, as you move to the right, the quit threshold gets tighter. So, sorry, gets looser. So fewer people are quitting. People with low experience aren't participating as you move towards the right. So during normal times to recessions, you get that quits fall. And then if you compare the two dashed lines, this is a husband unemployed is red, a husband unemployed during recession is purple. So that's kind of showing you this absence of added worker effects during a recession. Okay, so what we spend a lot of time in this paper that I'm not going to have any time to talk about here is getting all these elasticities correct. So we have to have that, for example, home productivity is increasing in the same, it's linked to kind of your market wage. So people who are very productive in the market are also very productive at home. This helps us replicate things like even high earning women still exit the labor force at high frequencies. That's just one example of a margin that we have to get right. Okay, so when we look at the quits during recession and we match it up with career types, what you're going to see is what I explained in the beginning. So life cycle women and women who mostly never work, they're the ones that actually have this labor supply margin to adjust. So they're the ones that are quitting less during recessions. I don't even put what we call these career women here because they never quit. So they're not quitting less during a recession. Okay, let me move on. So we want to now connect these two things. So we're calibrating the model to the 1940s cohort, and then one by one, I'm going to introduce these theories of increased labor supply. So the first, when we're thinking about returns to experience, this is the one I explained earlier. So when you increase how much you work today affects your future wage, you're going to get most of these career women that never quit. They're worried about building up that human capital for the future. And they're going to be less sensitive to transitory shocks like those over the business cycle. So within career types, volatility is decreasing. You don't care about transitory shocks so much. But then there's this composition effect that we're moving towards career women who don't have a quit margin to adjust, and they're the ones that have highest volatility. When we look at the gender wage gap decreasing, what we're doing is we're increasing from marginal participants to become life cycle women. So again, within career types, we get volatility decreasing, but in this example, the margins work together. It's precisely the life cycle women that have this margin to adjust, and so it's going to reduce business cycle volatility. So last theory is this fixed cost of work decreasing. This is kind of interesting. So what it's basically doing is it's shifting these kind of mid-productivity women from life cycle women to part-time. And this is actually, it's a really thick part of the distribution. So within career types, the volatility change varies because it's really focusing on those that are on the corner of the extensive margin. So it's not affecting some groups, it is affecting other groups. But then we have the composition effect. We end up with higher amounts of part-time women who also have relatively high volatility. They also work consistently, and so they don't have this quit margin to adjust over the business cycle. So when we add them up together, at this point in the paper, we're just taking each theory one at a time, and we're running it until we get the increase in women's labor force participation that we see in the data from the 1940s cohort to the 1960s. And you end up with the different effects that I told you. So for example, when we look at the returns to experience increasing, we get a bunch of career women. When we look at the cost of work decreasing, we get a bunch of part-time, and the wage gap decreasing, we get a bunch of life cycle women. And then that's the key thing for our results. So there's both a change in the composition, which is the population share of each group, and there's a change within that group's employment volatility. With the returns to experience, within group, we have decreases in employment volatility, but because we have so many more career women, we get on average an increase in volatility in the whole economy. You can compare that with a decrease in the wage gap. Here we have an increase in volatility, we have a decrease in volatility within each group, and the composition effect moves towards life cycle women who have the lowest volatility to begin with. So these effects work together to decrease business cycle volatility. And these numbers actually aren't that small for macroeconomists. When we talk about employment volatility over the business cycle, 1–2%, it is pretty substantial. Okay, so what we've shown so far in this paper is that married women actually are quantitatively very important for how we understand business cycles. And the increase in their labor force participation over time could be important for future business cycles. So we've used the model to predict what would happen. And so far we've looked at a few different theories and found that we could get different results. So what we have left to do is we have identification for these theories. We'll put them all in together at once. We'll make predictions for the total change in cyclicality, and we'll be able to look at cross-sectional welfare changes as well. And that is all.
Great, thanks, Amanda. So Erin, you have 7 minutes. And you may need to unmute. You're still muted. You're still muted.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Okay. Well, thanks, Henry, for organizing, and I've enjoyed all the papers in the session. And so I'll be discussing Amanda and Kathrin's paper, which I really enjoyed. The empirical facts are absolutely fascinating. They document this huge increase in employment of married women and married women's hours. And they show that it's driven by career women. And so they defined career women as women throughout their life cycle who generally work at least 30 hours a week or more. They also show that historically women's hours have been less volatile than men's hours and less volatile than single women's hours. And yet, despite the rise in married women's hours and employment being driven by career women, and career women look a lot like men, volatility hasn't changed all that much for married women. And so you see volatility, this picture that they have in the paper, it's looking at the cyclical component of hours, and married women are in red. And you'll notice that the red line throughout the sample period is more acyclical than the other lines. So there's fewer, the peaks and troughs aren't as dramatic. And so married women still are experiencing less volatile labor supply, despite career women making up a larger share. And earlier in the paper, they do this simple accounting exercise where they say, okay, let's fix the share of married women who are career women versus life cycle women versus part-time women to the 1976. And let's trace out what the implied path of volatility would be, and they find that volatility, in fact, would be a lot lower than even seen in this red line. And to mention that part of the reason that the volatility of married women is still lower than the other groups is because life cycle women and part-time women make up a sizable share, and those women are not going to leave the labor force in a recession, and so our labor supply is less volatile. Again, these facts are really enjoyable for me to learn. The model is super impressive, does a really nice job matching the data, and then looking at these three different theories that Amanda mentioned that can explain both the trends and changes in volatility. And so I look forward to their future work where they're going to identify which of these trends, identify which of these trends. One question that comes to mind when I was reading this was timing of motherhood and how this has changed over time. So when they're calibrating the market model, they're looking at 3 age groups, 25 to 40 to 55, and 55 to 60. And they target labor force status in these groups and also growth flows. And right now, size, or there's a share of women who actually have their first child before 25. And I think it's true even as you go past, further back, say to the 1940s. And so I wonder a little bit about what this would look like if this first age group incorporated younger women. I anticipate the reason that 25 was chosen was because that's, at least today, when a lot of folks are done with their schooling and really enter the labor market. But I think this is problematic, but a story that is close to home for me is thinking about women in the 1950s. My grandmother was married at the age of 17 in the 1950s. She had 4 kids and she was done with having kids at age 25. And then she went to become, to work as a cashier, right? And so in this framework, she would look like a career woman. But in fact, I think a life cycle woman would be more accurate, accurately describing her, because she didn't work from the age of 17 to 25 because she was having kids, she was raising kids. And so I wonder, there's so many structural changes that have happened to married women and married women over this this period, and I think the age of child rearing and also getting married has changed, and so I wonder how maybe incorporating that in the model could add to their findings. And so I'll just end with 2 cool pictures. This is from a New York Times article that was written in collaboration with a colleague of mine, Caitlin Myers at Middlebury College, and it's plotting data from the National Center for Health Statistics. And so these are the ages of first-time mothers in 1980. And surprising to me, the modal age is 19. Yeah, is 19. And so that, kind of thinking about in this paper, I think pushing that age group and looking at data of younger married women would be helpful. And then today it looks very different. So this is from 2016 and it's bimodal. There's a peak at, again, 19, but there's also another peak at 28. And in this article, they actually break it down by education. So more women who have college degrees are more likely to have their first kid later in life, but also married women are more likely to have their first kid later in life. And so in 2016, even though the average age of a woman for their first kid is 26, for married women, that's 29. So anyway, there's all these dimensions to look at, and yeah, I'd be curious what incorporating the change in child rearing, especially for those life cycle models, what that might mean for the model. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed the paper.
Great, thanks. So again, please use the Q&A feature if you'd like to ask a question from the audience. Amanda, would you like to respond?
Thanks, Erin. So those are all very good points. Yeah, women are complicated individuals that are interesting to study for macroeconomic outcomes. I think we agree on that. Looking into age of first child, also, I mean, divorce as well. We have spousal death in our model, and that's changed a lot. I think we could do a better job with the data, and we'll start working on that. So thank you.
Okay, great. So Henry, oh wait, looks like we have, let me just see. There's a Q&A in there from Stuart Glosser. Is there a significant difference between married men and married women employment status during a recession?
Okay, I'm not exactly sure what's meant by employment status. So I can say one thing is that we're looking at flows. So married men do lose their job at a little bit of a higher rate than married women. But the key thing is that women choosing not to quit goes down a lot more during recessions than it does for married men. So hopefully that helps answer the question a little bit.
Okay, so feel free to continue discussion in the Q&A. And Henry, if you'd like to share your slides, then you've got 20 minutes.
Start by unmuting myself. Everybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Now, is it in full screen mode?
Yes. And
Okay.
slide
All right, so
working?
it's not, you can't see like the Adobe stuff. Okay.
Nope. So
Great.
you got, I'll introduce you. I don't think you need the introduction. It's our organizer of our session. Henry is going to be presenting the cyclical labor market sorting. Thanks.
Well, so this is joint work with Leland Crane and Seth Murray, who are both here, and I believe are designated presenters. But I'll go ahead and present the paper today. Please note the disclaimer. So this is a paper on cyclical sorting. We're thinking about workers and firms who differ in terms of their intrinsic type or their intrinsic productivity. What we're after in this paper is, how does the joint distribution of workers and firms change over the business cycle? How does the joint distribution of workers and firms change over the business cycle? So how does composition change? Do we have shifts in employment for workers and firms of different types? And this is going to tell us a bunch of interesting things. It's going to allow us to make some progress in describing what the match production function looks like. That match production function takes workers and firms of different types, and when they match together, they get to form a particular amount of output. And this is going to have implications for mismatch, understanding inequality. There's some indication that there may be cyclical trends in labor reallocation rates, even trend changes in labor reallocation rates. This exercise is going to have something to say about the cleansing and sullying effects of recessions. So we're going to use matched employer-employee data for the United States, specifically 11 states that consistently have data available for a 20-year span, 1994 to 2014. We're also going to use relatively newly available business revenue data from the Census Bureau Business Register. What we're going to find, what we find in our paper is that we see significant changes in the composition of workers and firms over the business cycle. During recessions, we see that the worker type distribution shifts away from lower type workers toward more productive workers in recessions. This has a pretty straightforward interpretation as a cleansing effect of recessions. You see the least productive workers leaving during recessions. For firms, however, we find the opposite. During recessions, and especially in the times of high unemployment that follow recessions, we see shifts in the employment distribution away from high-type firms or from highly productive firms toward less productive firms. And this seems to have more of an interpretation of a sullying effect of recessions. The changes in sorting that we document in this paper follow naturally from the changes in worker and firm compositions. We see a significant shift away from low-ranked workers at high-ranked firms. That's because there are fewer low-ranked workers participating in employment, and there are fewer workers at high-ranked firms. So that would seem to increase the agreement between worker and firm ranks. Now, at the same time, and especially in the periods of high unemployment that follow recessions, we see a shift toward an increase in employment of high-ranked workers at low-ranked firms. And so that doesn't necessarily increase the agreement between worker and firm ranks. But on net, we find that especially in the early stages of recessions, that there's a small increase in the degree of agreement in the between worker rank and firm rank. And then to try to make sense of these novel facts, we're going to assess them in light of the model of cyclical labor market sorting proposed by Lees and Raban. So we rank workers and firms in several different ways in this paper. Our baseline estimates, and then the ones that we're going to use when we estimate the Least-Norban model and target additional moments, are the duration that workers spend in employment, and that's to rank workers, and we rank firms by the amount of poaching that they do. That is, the number of hires that come from other employers, that is, hires from employer to employer transitions, as a share of all hires. A second method of ranking workers and firms is going to be very simple, based on the average earnings of workers and the average productivity of the firms. Now, this average productivity of the firms is a proxy that we construct. We take value added per worker from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and we add in the deviation of that firm's revenue per worker from the industry level average. So the sum of the industry average from BEA, value added per worker, and the idiosyncratic firm level contribution is going to be our productivity measure. Right. Our third method of ranking workers and firms is going to be the additive model proposed by Aboud, Kramers, and Margolis. And then the fourth method of ranking workers and firms is going to follow the recent Econometrica paper by Hagedorn, LalÄ, and Manofsky. The fourth method ranks workers by ranking workers and then re-ranking workers against their co-workers to ensure that more productive workers are always paid more than less productive workers. That's the way to rank workers. And then to rank firms, you take you estimate or proxy for the surplus that's generated by the match. That's the difference between the observed earnings of those workers and the implied reservation earnings, basically the minimum earnings that you observe for workers of a particular type. So we're kind of taking all of those terms as given, and we're going to see we're going to show a pretty consistent pattern of changes in composition and sorting over the business cycle. So first, I'm going to show you results for workers. So here I'm showing you the changes in composition by worker rank for our four different ranking methods. The solid line are the changes in composition. This is quarterly changes in composition for workers of low rank, and the dashed line is going to be the change in employment composition for workers of high rank. And what you can see is that during recessions, we've got the 2001 recession and the 2007 to 2009 recession, we see a sharp increase in the share of employment of high rank workers, and we see a shift down in the employment of low rank workers. And that's consistent across the different ranking methods. So how responsive are these changes in the share of employment for workers and firms of different types to economic conditions? Well, we're going to use the unemployment rate as our measure of the state of the labor market. And we have two different cyclical indicators. We have the difference in the unemployment rate from its HP trend. That's the first couple of rows, and then the second couple of rows are the first difference of the unemployment rate. These tell us the difference in unemployment from its HP trend shows us how changes in employment composition respond to times of high versus low unemployment, and the first difference of the unemployment rate essentially shows us how the composition of workers and firms changes when the unemployment rate is spiking during NBER recessions. And we see here is that in response to a 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate, we see on the order of less than 0.5% change in the employment share of low rank and high rank workers. We see that when the unemployment rate goes up by a percentage point, low-rank workers decreased their employment share by about 0.04 or by about 0.4 percentage points, and high-ranked workers increased their employment share by about 0.3 percentage points. So we see differences in magnitude across the different ranking methods, but they're qualitatively similar. We also see that the changes in employment composition are much more closely aligned to NBER recessions than they are to the times of high unemployment that follow recessions. So our first set of findings on changes in worker composition over the business cycle are pretty straightforward. They have the natural interpretation of a cleansing effect. We see that during recessions, worker composition shifts away from low-ranked workers and toward high-ranked workers. So what about firms? So I told you that we see an opposite pattern in terms of the cyclical changes in composition by firm rank. Again, the solid line indicates the low-rank firms, and the dashed line indicates the high rank. So here, I'll make it a little bigger so that you can see what's going on. This is particularly for what you're looking at right now is the firms ranked by their poaching hire shares. So the high-ranked firms get a lot of their workers through employer-to-employer transitions. The lower-ranked firms are those that rely on the pool of non-employed to obtain their workers. What we see is that during the 2001 recession, the 2007 to 2009 recession, during and especially after those recessions, immediately after those recessions, we see that low-ranked firms are increasing their share of employment, and high-ranked firms, by contrast, are losing employment. So we see an opposite counter-cyclical shift in employment composition for firms of different types. And that these are qualitatively similar across the different ranking methods. Again, to summarize how responsive these are to aggregate conditions, we use our cyclical indicators, and we can see that in response to a 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate, we see about a point on the order of a 0.0 to 0.1 increase in the employment share of low-ranked firms, and a 0.5 to 0.9% decline in the employment share of high-ranked firms. So there's the question: is this driven by the poaching or the non-employment margin? And we find that the countercyclical increase in the employment share of low-ranked firms is driven by the poaching margin rather than the non-employment margin. Non-employment hiring responds similarly to the labor market for both low-rank and high-rank firms, whereas for it's the employer-to-employer transition hiring that's really different for low-rank versus high-rank firms. And what does this mean? It means that the increase in the employment share of low-rank firms is driven by the fact that the employer-to-employer transition rate that tends to move workers from low-rank to high-rank firms, that shuts down during recessions. That seems to be some indication of the mechanism. So what did I show you? During and especially after recessions, there's a shift away from high-ranked firms towards low-ranked firms. And there's evidence of both a cleansing and a sullying effect of recessions. But the sullying effects dominate, especially in times of high unemployment. So now I'll show you the evidence that we have on sorting. This is the agreement between worker rank and firm rank. So here I'm showing you how the joint distribution of workers and firms changes over the business cycle. And I mentioned that the patterns that we see in terms of sorting follow naturally from the shifts in composition. So what do we see? Well, what increases the degree of agreement between worker rank and firm rank? Well, high-ranked firms employ relatively fewer low-ranked workers during and after recessions. That's what this row means. When we have a 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate, we see around a 0.04 to a 0.2 percentage point decline in the share of low-ranked workers at high-ranked firms. And by contrast, we see that there's an increase in the employment share of high-rank workers at low-rank firms, and this margin decreases the degree of agreement between worker rank and firm rank. And we see that the share of high-rank workers at low-rank firms increases. All right. So to put all this together, we can use the rank correlation between workers and firms as kind of a summary metric of which one wins out. I showed you in the previous slide that the increase in the share of high-rank workers at low-rank firms decreases the degree of agreement between worker rank and firm rank, whereas the decline in the employment share of low-rank workers at high-rank firms increases the degree of agreement. And we see that, especially during the times of during NBER recessions, during which the unemployment rate is surging, we see a small increase in the degree of agreement between workers and firms. All right, so those are all the facts. This is what I just told you. Correlation between worker rank and firm ranks increases slightly when the unemployment rate increases. So those are the facts. How do we make sense of them? Well, we take the model of LalÃ and Raban. This model is convenient because it has heterogeneous worker types, that's this X variable, heterogeneous firm types, that's this Y variable, and it allows us to think about the business cycle because it has this aggregate state Z. So the output of worker and firm matches is going to be a function of the worker type, the firm type, and the aggregate state. And basically, we use a cubic polynomial in both worker type and firm type and an interaction. This is a model of cyclical job search that includes on-the-job search. Firms are making take-it-or-leave-it offers to workers, and the wages are determined by Bertrand competition. The workers are paid according to what their second highest job offer indicates. What's nice about this framework is that it's extremely tractable for business cycle analysis because the total match surplus depends only on the production function and the aggregate state variable, not on endogenous distributions. All right, so we try to make sense of our facts by targeting them as moments in the LalÃ and Raban framework. So obviously, the LalÃ and Raban did not target the worker and firm composition moments that we had. So we don't necessarily expect their framework to produce those. And so, in this table, we're summarizing what new moments we're attempting to target in their framework. We're showing you what the model gives without targeting them, and then we have what we obtain after we target those moments. I'll first point out that the LalÃ and Raban framework does a surprisingly accurate job predicting what we obtain for cyclical composition by worker type when we target it in our employment duration ranking method. An increase in the 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate, had a 0.04 percentage point decline in the low rank workers and a 0.03 percentage point increase in the high rank workers, and LalÃ and Raban gets that almost exactly. Where LalÃ and Raban doesn't necessarily naturally yield our cyclical composition is in terms of firm composition. In LalÃ and Raban, just their baseline estimates, that they show evidence of cleansing for both the worker and the firm distributions, whereas when we target our cyclical composition moments, we obtain sullying of the firm distribution. What does this tell us? Well, there are two facts that I'll say in my 2 remaining minutes. The first is that the estimated production function appears to be driven by worker rank rather than firm rank. So here I've got how worker type and firm type transform into output, and we see that there's a lot of change in the amount of output when you go across worker ranks, but it's relatively flat in the firm type. So that's the first fact that appears to be necessary for us to obtain this countercyclical cleansing of the firm distribution, countercyclical sullying of the firm distribution. Second is that the sullying effects of the firm distribution really have to dominate. So here I'm showing the cyclical change in vacancies by firm type. That's what's here on the x-axis, on the horizontal axis. And we have the distribution of vacancies by particular types. Now, the ones in the middle of the distribution are the highest value offers. And what we see is that, and I've got this dotted line here, this dashed line, which shows the relative number of vacancies for a low versus a high shock. Now, when you have a economic downturn, when you have a recession, naturally there are fewer vacancies, but at the extremes of the distribution, there are a lot fewer vacancies. This is kind of the cleansing effect of recessions. What we see is that for some relatively low-ranked firms, we see a non-monotonicity in the number of vacancies posted, and this is where we get our sullying effect. And I'll point out that Lease and Raban have this non-monotonicity in their baseline parameters, although they don't necessarily explore this aspect of their model. What our targeting these additional moments suggests that non-monotonicity may be greater. So I'm out of time. Yeah, so this is what I just said. So thank you very much. Erin, I look forward to your comments.
Great. Erin, you've got the floor for the next 7 minutes, and then see if there's questions. Again, use the Q&A if you're in the audience.
All right, thanks, Henry, and thanks for the opportunity to discuss this paper. This has been a very enjoyable session for me. Learned a lot, and yeah, a great batch of papers. So I thought I'd start for this paper with trying to place it in the literature, although I'm not sure I'm necessarily the right person to do it, but I'll do my best, and this is an incomplete list of papers that study this. But there's a little bit of a debate whether recessions are cleansing or whether they're sullying, right? Recessions are cleansing if productive jobs are destroyed, and there's evidence of that. Recessions are sullying if more productive jobs, or often matches, think of matches here, if productive matches are destroyed. And this is important, I think, because these cleansing and sullying effects can last beyond the recession, and they can be potentially the reason for a slower or quicker recovery. And I've worked with Mariana Kudlik on skill mismatch after the Great Recession. So, what is so cool about this paper is it breaks up the question, and it looks at recessions separately for workers, to find out if they're cleansing or sullying, and recession separates for firms to see if they're cleansing or sullying. And the big takeaway is recessions. They find that recessions are cleansing for workers. The employment distribution shifts to high rank workers, or I'm going to use that interchangeably with high quality because it's a little bit easier for me to wrap my head around, but more accurately high rank. And recessions are sullying for firms. So the employment distribution of firms shifts to low quality firms. And I don't think this was known before. So this is super cool in how recessions can be both cleansing and sullying for different actors. Super impressive use of the LEHD data. In particular, the big question in doing this is, how do you measure quality, or of workers and firms? And the authors measure quality of workers and firms in 4 different ways. And one of the things that I was pleasantly surprised about is that regardless of what way you measure quality, the results are the same. They still find workers of these different measures of quality. Recessions are cleansing for workers and sullying for firms. And then the last part of the paper, they estimate the Lisa Robin 2017 paper with these additional moments that they calculate from the LEHD data to get essentially a more accurate model of what's happening in the world. Okay, so I have my comments. I have 3 of them. 2 of them are really small, and the last one is just I'm curious what else you could do with the model. So the first is, and this is because I'm a recent graduate from UCSD, that I worry a little bit about the HP filter. And this is a tiny comment because the authors not only look at how worker and firm quality relates to filtered unemployment rate, but how it relates to the first difference of the unemployment rate. And results are the same whichever way you look at it. So I don't think this is a big deal, but I do worry about the HP filter because Hamilton, in a paper called Why You Should Never Use the HP Filter, finds that the way that the filter works is it filters the ends of the sample differently than the middle and potentially could introduce some spurious correlation. Again, I don't think this is a problem because the results are robust using first difference. And I guess my preference would be just to get rid of the HP filter part. I'll also add that I suspect the authors might include the COVID recession either in this paper or in future work. And I think maybe then the HP filter could really matter because the COVID recession would be at the end of the sample. It's this large negative shock, and how it's weighted could potentially matter a lot. So that's just a small thing. The other thing that just an idea I had was, so one of the ways that the paper measures firms is looking at the share of new hires at a firm, how many of them are coming from another employment spell. So essentially are being poached. I think this is a great way to look at it. But I worry a little bit about the quarterly frequency. So if a worker was at another firm last quarter, and then this quarter we can see them at this firm, and that looks good. That looks like that worker was poached, and that's a signal that this firm is of high quality. A lot could have happened within that quarter that we don't observe the data. If the worker was non-employed or unemployed, we wouldn't see it. And so I wonder if, since you have such rich data, if just slightly tweaking the definition of a poaching to being someone who does EE transition, but then also experiences a wage increase, because that would, I think, be more in line with that worker was poached and didn't experience unemployment in between. Okay, and then I just want to quickly wrap up. The model does a great job at replicating the data. Super cool that you're able to add these other moments. I wonder what more could be done. I kind of want to see what happens with, could you turn off the cleansing effect or the flying effect and see what happens to the unemployment level, but also the volatility. So anyway, really fantastic paper. Thank you. And I'll end there. So there's a minute for questions.
Great. Thanks, Erin. Henry, if you want to take a minute to respond. I'd just like to thank everybody just before we go. Thank you, Henry. Thank you to the presenters. And really thanks to Discussants for making the effort and making the world go around. Okay.
Yes, and thank you for discussing 2 papers each. I know that's a lot. Okay. Yeah, thanks. So I guess one of the most common questions we get asked, my co-authors and I, when we're using matched employer-employee data to study employer-to-employer transitions, is this idea that there might be measurement error in our measurement of the employer-to-employer transition rate, because we only have quarterly earnings totals. If you see somebody earning a lot at one employer in one quarter and then they're earning a lot at a different employer in the next quarter, you assume there's an employer-to-employer transition. But we know that people could have a small gap in their employment spell, right? So for the purposes of this paper, I think that's just going to attenuate our results. So we're obtaining the results in the presence of measurement error. To the extent that we obtain our results, even though there's measurement error, that doesn't necessarily undermine the accuracy of the results. But there's also a separate literature to which I've contributed, in which we do try to throw out workers with small implied gaps of non-employment, and generally results are qualitatively similar in terms of employer-to-employer transitions over the business cycle, including by firm types, especially when we're using broad terciles, low, middle, and high. Those don't necessarily change a lot when you have these small definitional differences. I'm also sympathetic to the endpoints issues. Not only are there endpoint issues inherent in our use of the HP filter, but there are also endpoint issues in our application of time invariant worker and firm types to our matched employer-employee data. So yes, there are definitely endpoint issues. So you should take